The majority of it is happening now. Does that mean that therefore it's a good thing because the majority believe in it? The majority believes in all kinds of weird stuff, man, because if you can silence the minority, if you can silence the people who are speaking rationally, you can make people believe that that's the majority. And then people gravitate towards the majority. I mean, in a very practical sense, if you see a whole crowd of people running over in a certain direction, what do we tend to do? Look over there. A lot of times we even start running over there without even knowing why we're running over there. Because people love a crowd. It gives us a sense of safety, it gives us a sense of belonging. And as much as we say, you have to be your own self, you have to be your own individual, very few people actually believe it because it's hard to do. Because first you have to know who you are, and then you have to have the courage to stand up against it. It's very easy to believe that who we are is just like everybody else. And if you are just like everybody else, there's absolutely no problem with that. You just think like everybody else. Yeah, because that's what tends to happen. The world is propelled, it's also held back by people who think very differently. And so when we talk about the majority of opinions, I wonder how often that really is the case, that the majority really is the majority, because there's oftentimes a really large group of people who are in the minority who just don't say anything. Even as I talk with classes and ask students for opinions, I generally know what most of the opinions probably are. But I also know that most people are not going to say anything. And I notice that a lot of times, of course nothing is everything, but a lot of times the people who say the most are the people who have the most extreme opinions. Or at least the people who are used to talking about their opinions, or the people who have the opinions that seem to be the most supported. But especially, for example, this is probably 6 or 7 years ago, I'm guessing now. We had a dude named Carl who wore a dress and ran for homecoming queen. And Carl was an anomaly, because Carl went by the name Carl, wore a dress, and didn't claim to be a girl or anything, just said, yeah, I am, And so this person ran for homecoming queen, and guess what? He won. So high. And there was this thing going on when he was running that. People would ask in class, so what do you guys think about it? And there were friends who look around just to make sure that everybody had the correct opinion. And if you listen to people in classes talk, it was always very much oh, definitely, yeah, very supportive and all that. But I'm not exaggerating. Overwhelmingly, I have students talking to me privately. Well, what do you think, Scallon? I'm like, it doesn't matter what I think. I'm not voting. What do you think? Overwhelmingly. That's weird. I'm not into it. I don't like it. Why don't you say something during class? I don't want to get yelled at. I don't want to get called names. I don't want to. Okay, so I don't know if it was a majority. I don't know if it was a majority of people who were just kind of cowed into being silent. You never can tell. Because when we foster an environment where people become afraid to talk, then we can give the impression that there's a majority of people who feel a certain way, and then a weird thing happens. If you believe that the majority of people have a certain opinion, then it's very easy to join that majority, especially if you just don't have a dog in the fight. In other words, if you just don't really have strong feelings one way or the other. If I see all over Instagram people who just, all I want for Christmas is a free Palestine. Do you really support Palestine? Do you really know what's going on there? Do you know what's going on between the Palestinians and the Israelis and how deep that thing goes? And no, they don't know anything about that. But it's really easy just to repost something, and if you don't really care about it one way or the other, it's easy just to get some social virtue points by saying, you know what, yeah, I agree with what everybody seems to be saying. And then when you actually study it and you find out what people actually think about it, it's nothing at all like that. But if you can give people the impression that everyone thinks this, well, then you have to be absolutely crazy not to go along with it. And we saw this, you guys were still in middle school though, or junior high school, but when the whole thing with the COVID stuff happened, every doctor believed the same thing about it, right? No. The doctors who disagreed with it, in fact, it was very famously a couple of ER doctors who were treating literally hundreds of COVID patients. And they said, what we're finding is not what the CDC is telling us. YouTube pulled their channels and they got them suspended and then they ended up getting temporarily suspended from their hospital. They weren't allowed to say anything. So you take a person who disagrees, boom, another person who disagrees, boom, take another person who disagrees, and then all that's left are the people that agree with you. And then you say, see, everyone agrees. And if you don't agree with that, you're crazy. There's something wrong with you. Now, whatever it is that you think about the pandemic and how it was handled and all that, that's not the important point here. The important point here is that if you set out to limit voices, to silence people, well, then you can create the impression that every sane person believes something. Fill in the blank, whatever it is, especially political causes, especially today. It's like, if I, in a classroom here, if I say something like, if I say anything religious at all, if I mention God, I can see people like visibly shrivel and get nervous and get scared, especially if I talk about different gods. People get nervous. We're not supposed to talk about that. Why not? Well, because we're not supposed to. The majority of you believe in some kind of a God or higher power or something. The overwhelming majority of you guys believe in that. You may not believe in the same God or the same higher power, but just that word itself freaks people out. I mean, even if you say that you believe in karma, if you believe in karma, then you have to believe in a higher power, because there has to be a higher power who decides what's good, what's a good action, and what's a bad action. And there has to be a higher being that then kind of manipulates the universe to make sure that good deeds are repaid with good deeds and bad deeds are repaid with bad deeds. It doesn't happen just by luck or happen chance. There has to be a deity manipulating all that, orchestrating all that. And yet, although the overwhelming majority of people believe in some kind of a concept like that, there's a small vocal minority who then kind of makes everybody else feel like we shouldn't talk about that, we can't say that. What ends up happening is that you start to believe, well, then nobody believes in that, or nobody, no sensible person believes in that because everyone has been silenced, and it's really easy to shape opinions that way. And then if you do finally come out and say, no, I don't think that Carla should be the homecoming queen, or yes, I am religious, and whichever side of the Palestinian-Israeli thing you'd be on, let's say you're on the opposite side of the popular opinion, then all of a sudden everyone looks at you like, oh, you're the extremist. There's something wrong with you. And there might be something wrong with you. I don't know. But we will never find out if there's something wrong with you or if there's something wrong with everybody else unless we have the ability to talk about it and figure out what is right and what's wrong. I mean, if you go back, just go back to like the civil rights movement. What was the popular opinion was that civil rights shouldn't happen. There shouldn't be equal rights. Imagine if all of that dissent had just been shut down and nobody was allowed to talk about it. Imagine if we didn't have free speech back then. What would have happened? Well, what would have happened is we wouldn't be here right now, for sure. It was only because of the ability to talk about things and the protections to talk about things that things changed. And that's the only way that you can change things. Be very cautious of people who are trying to stop you from talking about things, because there's a very good chance that they're trying to stop you from changing anything. And then, of course, it's good to wonder why they want you to not change things. And again, change is not always good. There's terrible change. There's bad change. There's also very good change. But we can't figure out what those things are unless we talk about them. The point of life is not to be on the side of the majority, because the majority believe all kinds of strange things, man. At one point, in the Soviet Union, the majority of people believed in communism. I don't know how many people have to die before we finally say, maybe not such a good idea. Under Stalin and afterwards, 30 to 50 million people died under communism. In the 20th century alone, it's over 100 million people, I think it's close to 150 million people murdered because of communism. And yet we still have people who come along today and say, you know what, it's a good idea in theory, we just haven't done it right yet. And that's what every dictator who comes along and says. You know what? It hasn't been done right yet. Give me a chance. I will do it right. And it was creeping me out. I was reading these studies recently about how, especially your generation, is leaning far away from democratic processes and is leaning very much towards like that kind of a system, essentially a dictator system. There's this belief that democracy, we're unhappy with how things are right now, so therefore democracy just doesn't work. We need to have somebody come along and just make things happen. And that creeps me out for the future, because I don't know what that's going to mean in 20 or 30 years. I know what it means 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or 80 years ago. I can tell you what that's about. It's in the history books, and the graves are out there to prove it. But People at one point, I mean, even today, we had this thing of like, slavery, terrible thing. Dude, there's more slavery in the world today than there ever has been in the history of the world. The majority of it is happening now. Does that mean that therefore it's a good thing because the majority believe in it? The majority believes in all kinds of weird stuff, man, because if you can silence the minority, if you can silence the people who are speaking rationally, you can make people believe that that's the majority. And then people gravitate towards the majority. I mean, in a very practical sense, if you see a whole crowd of people running over in a certain direction, what do we tend to do? Look over there. A lot of times we even start running over there without even knowing why we're running over there, because people love a crowd. Wherever there's a crowd, people tend to go. It gives us a sense of safety, it gives us a sense of belonging. And as much as we say, you have to be your own self, you have to be your own individual, very few people actually believe it because it's hard to do. Because first you have to know who you are, and then you have to have the courage to stand up against it. And it's very easy to believe that who we are is just like everybody else. And if you are just like everybody else, there's absolutely no problem with that. We present it like it's a terrible thing. You just think like everybody else. Yeah, because that's what tends to happen. The world is propelled, it's also held back by people who think very differently. So the point isn't to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding yourselves in the ranks of the insane. So then the question becomes, how is it that the majority becomes insane? The majority becomes insane because it starts to believe its own bullshit. It starts to believe that it's the only right way. Bless you. It starts to believe it's the only right way, and then there's this mass psychosis that takes over among people, where we just think like anything else that's different, there's something wrong with it. It's stupid, it's dumb, it's terrible. And then people go crazy with that stuff. And then we start to believe all kinds of insane, weird things. I could list them off for you, but I imagine some of you already know what some of those really strange, weird, insane things are that we can believe at the same time. So, the minority is important. The minority is really important. Strange people are important. Weirdos, creative people are very important. Doesn't mean that they're right, but man, at least it's a different voice. At least it's something different from what we normally hear. If I were to ask you guys to start naming off these groups, like the rich kids, gangbangers, if I started to ask you to name off all of the different cliques and groups at Sweetwater, I wonder how many of you would not fit into any of those groups. And yet we would think that those groups represent everybody else. I guess as many of you wouldn't fit into most of the groups that we would name. And even if you were, like, for example, even if you say, like, okay, the athletes, maybe you don't see yourself as that. Maybe you play a sport. Maybe you are an athlete, but you don't feel like you belong to that kind of a clique. So you're going to find a lot of times in life that the real cliques of life are made up by the people who don't have cliques. So it's not really a clique at all. It's just a bunch of individuals trying to find a majority. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, criticisms, critiques? Yeah.
Why would a Roman emperor want people to think for themselves?
That might be one of the best questions I've ever been asked.